I was in the delivery room, my clothes soaked with blood, enduring the tearing pain of the incision, when I saw that message pop up on his phone. Come back quickly, don't let her get suspicious. The sender was Sophia, the one I trusted most. I lay there, my hand still holding the son who had been born less than 5 minutes ago, his phone having fallen from his pocket. The screen lit and went dark, lit and went dark again, each flash stabbing into my eyes like a needle. I didn't cry, I wasn't even surprised. It was just at that moment I suddenly understood what it means when a page in life is turned and can never be turned back. On the 30th day after giving birth, I woke before dawn. The baby lay curled in the crib, sleeping deeply, cheeks rosy, his little mouth twitching as if dreaming. I watched him for a long time until a faint ache swelled in my chest. Only then did I lower my head, unbutton my nursing top, and gently lift him into my arms. The room was oppressively quiet, apart from the child's and my breathing, there was no sound at all. I glanced instinctively at the bedside, where my husband should have been, empty, not even the blanket was disturbed. It was the 4th night he hadn't come home to sleep. My mother-in-law said he was busy with work, adding a touch of sarcasm, "You're almost finished with your confinement, why are you still so clingy?" I smiled faintly and said nothing. I'm not clingy, I just want to know where the man who walked into marriage with me and cut our son's umbilical cord with his own hands has put me now. There was the sound of a key in the lock at the door. I hurriedly put the child back into the crib, threw on my coat, and went out. You're back? I asked, keeping my voice low. He tossed his car keys into the bowl on the cabinet, his gaze flickered for a moment. Worked late, he said. I looked at the shirt he was wearing, so neat it looked like it had just been changed. Then at the shoes on his feet, the same pair as yesterday. The dust on the heels had shifted, which meant he'd been somewhere else, but certainly not the office. Have you eaten? I asked. He nodded, but didn't look at me. You go feed the baby. I'll go take a shower first. I stood where I was, my fingers unconsciously clutching the hem of my clothes. The feeling in my chest was like standing on a thin sheet of ice, a crack spreading rapidly outward from beneath my feet. After the bathroom door closed, I walked slowly to the suit jacket he had left by the entryway and took his phone from the pocket. He had changed the lock screen passcode. I didn't try many times, and I didn't ask. I just put the phone back where it belonged and wandered slowly back to the bedroom. The baby slept soundly, but I couldn't feel any happiness at all. In the evening, Sophia came to visit me. She wore a form-fitting knit dress, light makeup, and carried the box from my favorite pastry shop. Your face still looks bad. She sat on the edge of the bed. Has your milk not come in yet? I nodded and smiled a little. It's okay. She felt the baby's forehead. So adorable, just like you. I watched her long nails touch the child's face and suddenly remembered the contact name on that message on my phone from a few days ago. Her tone was natural, her eyes even gentler than mine. I asked, "Did you get a new phone recently?" She paused, then smiled and said, "Yes, the old one broke, so I got a new one." I smiled too. What a coincidence. After she left, I stood by the window and didn't move. The streetlight below stretched her shadow long. After she walked out of the complex, she took out her phone and looked down to send a message. A minute later, my husband's phone sounded in the study. He unlocked it and replied with "OK." I tiptoed over and glanced at the screen from behind him. In that instant he reflexively snapped the phone shut, his hand freezing for a moment. I said nothing, just stared at him. He was stunned for 3 seconds, managed a forced smile. "A client is pushing for some documents, I was just calling back." Then he went out onto the balcony and closed the door. I didn't follow. I walked back to the living room slowly, picked up his suit jacket, and pulled out the receipt with the corner barely peeking out. It read, "A certain upscale hotel, 2-person suite, 1 night." The date signed was the 2nd day after my child was born. I heard a lowered voice from the balcony, "She didn't notice." "I'll take care of it." I stood in the middle of the living room, the receipt in my hand slowly crumpling into a ball. That suffocating feeling rolled over me like a tide. The baby cried. I turned, walked step by step toward the room, and picked him up. His hand clung tightly to a corner of my clothing, his eyes were shut, defenselessly trusting me. I sat down holding him, and at that moment the tears finally fell, dripping onto his forehead. I'm sorry, I choked out, Mom picked the wrong person. His eyelashes fluttered, and a little froth appeared at the corner of his mouth. I bent down and kissed his small face, whispering, but don't be afraid, I'll protect you, from now on. Outside, the sky at last grew a little brighter. I looked down at the child, and that message flashed through my mind, hurry back, don't let her get suspicious. The phone screen lit up again, and this time it was a location pop-up. His whereabouts were not the office, not a client's home, but my Sophia's house. At 4:30 a.m. I was woken by a faint buzz from my phone. The child was still fast asleep. I groped to turn off the bedside lamp, the room was as dark as a deep well. I didn't open that pop-up message. Instead I tapped his location history. 2 nights ago, when his phone had been left on the sofa, I had secretly installed Find My device in the background of a social app. That blue dot sat quietly in an old residential compound in the city center, on a building I knew all too well. I could recognize the door number, that was Sophia's address. He had told me he was working late that night, and she had told me she had been at home with a headache and fever, too afraid to go out. 2 people telling different lies had, between them, spelled out a whole truth. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I just put the phone back on the bedside table and stared at the ceiling for 10 minutes. Dawn was just breaking. I put on my coat and sent my mother-in-law a WeChat message, I'm not feeling well today, I want to go back to my parents for a couple of days. She called back quickly, a thin thread of impatience in her tone, the baby's almost a month old, why are you being so delicate? I said, the doctor advised it. She tooted and hung up. I finished packing, called a car, and gently placed the baby into the carrier. The driver was a man in his 40s, seeing me alone with the infant carrier, he looked a little surprised. Nobody with you? I smiled briefly. Everyone's busy at home. And your husband? He asked again. Too busy, he didn't even have time to come when the baby was born. I said it as if I were talking about someone else's life, my tone flat. The driver paused for 2 seconds, then fell silent. I sat in the back seat, watching the cityscape rush past the window, feeling as if I had been wrapped up in a storm of silence that left me speechless. When I arrived at my parents' home, my mother was in the kitchen making breakfast. Hearing the door, she poked her head out and saw me standing there alone with a suitcase. Her expression immediately darkened. Why did you come back without saying anything? I said, my mother-in-law said I'm too delicate. I'm afraid the child would be affected too. A flicker of hesitation crossed her eyes, but she didn't say more, she only sighed softly. Sit down, the porridge will be ready soon. I had no appetite, but I still ate a few spoonfuls with her. She said that lately the neighbors have been talking about a certain family's daughter-in-law, that she had just given birth and her husband was already fooling around outside. I listened and then suddenly laughed. She looked up at me, frowning, what are you laughing at? I'm just thinking that when this sort of thing happens to other people, everyone can criticize and pass judgment, but when it happens to you, you feel ashamed. She was silent for a few seconds, then said softly, if you think he's no good, get a divorce. Your mother can support you. I felt my nose sting, Mom, it's not that I'm afraid of not having enough to eat. I'm afraid the child will be born into a family that's not whole. She paused, then said, you think the family you have now is whole? I didn't speak. In that moment, I suddenly realized I had been compromising for something that doesn't exist, a complete family that exists only in my imagination. My phone buzzed, a message from my husband, Mom says you're not well, don't be angry, come home early. I looked at the screen and lightly swiped delete. All day I had been at my parents' house with the child. He was especially good, as if he sensed my low spirits, he hardly cried the whole day. That night, I secretly opened Sophia's post. She had posted a photo, a cup of coffee and a book, captioned, "It's nice to be alone." The corner where the picture was taken I recognized, the tabletop on her balcony, and in the glass's reflection there was the vague silhouette of a man's back. I enlarged the photo and studied it bit by bit until I saw on that silhouette's wrist the black leather watch I had given my husband. Early the next morning I called the property management, lied that my husband's phone was lost, and asked them to help pull the surveillance footage. I replayed the clip at the community gate 5 times. At 9:37 p.m. he entered her residential complex, wearing the wool coat I had chosen for him. At 2:12 a.m. he left the complex, carrying a takeout bag. He really was working overtime, only he was working her shift. I sat on the bench in the complex, the child sleeping quietly in my arms, while my heart felt as if someone were hammering it blow by blow, a pain that had gone numb. That night I didn't go back to my in-laws' home, and I didn't reply to his messages. And he, as if it were his habit, didn't ask again. I suddenly realized that our communication had long since become routine, an unasked busy, a message unchecked rest early, a couple's photo without any emotion. I thought about confronting him, about smashing my phone, about throwing the child in front of him to show him what he had ruined. But I did nothing. I only opened the calendar, circled the baby's birth date in red, and on the next page wrote, Day 1 of evidence gathering. I knew I couldn't act on impulse, because the real battle wouldn't be in tears but in the courtroom. The child woke suddenly, looking at me with clear eyes. I held him tight and whispered, Mommy promises you, no matter how hard it gets, I will never give up on you. His little hand closed around my finger, not very strong, but gripping tightly. In that moment I understood that what would support me going forward was no longer the man who had betrayed me, but this tiny life in my arms, not yet able to speak. My phone vibrated again. It was his location request, saved as, wife. I gave a cold laugh, swiped the screen, and watched his position remain motionless beneath Sophia's building. I closed the phone, settled the baby into the stroller, and pushed him slowly onward. Under the streetlights, I put distance between myself and the place called home, bit by bit. When I came back home, my mother-in-law's face was as black as the bottom of a pot. She was sitting on the living room sofa, holding the baby with awkward, fidgety hands, muttering something under her breath. I walked over to take the baby, but she clutched the child to her like a hen guarding its chicks and said, You keep running around like this, the baby will get shy of you. I held my temper. The doctor recommended more sun to help my mood. I went to my mother's for a couple of days to try and reset. She snorted and shoved the baby back into my arms. You didn't even finish your confinement properly and you're out and about. Don't come crying when you get sick. I bent over to soothe the child and said nothing. Seeing I stayed silent, she lost interest in nagging and turned back to her room. That night, my husband came home very late, drunk, reeking of cheap cologne. I helped him into the bedroom. He flopped onto the bed, muttering sorry and trying to take my hand. I gently withdrew my hand, tucked the blanket around him, and stood at the bedside watching him for a few seconds. This face I once knew intimately now seemed like a stranger wearing a mask. He slept deeply, still mumbling indistinctly, she said, she'll handle it. I bent down, pulled the duvet up to cover his babbling mouth, and then turned off the light. The next morning I woke earlier than usual and took the coat I had tucked into the wardrobe the night before back out to inspect it. Sure enough, there was a restaurant receipt in the inner pocket clearly stamped romantic couples set. The time of the charge was 8:30 the previous evening. I quietly photographed it, put the original back, then opened a drawer and took out the USB drive I had prepared earlier. These were parts of the chat logs I'd secretly backed up from his old phone over the past few days. With the help of a tech-savvy friend, I used a recovery program to extract some deleted conversation fragments. A line on the screen almost made me choke, she's too obtuse, she won't notice. That word she was me. The sender was him, and the recipient was that string of unfamiliar digits whose contact name had long been deleted, but by comparing photos I knew it was Sophia's old phone number. My hand holding the phone trembled, my breathing grew heavy. But I could not cry, could not make a scene, could not let him sense that I already knew everything. The moment I showed any reaction, I'd spook the snake. I needed more proof. Something clear, direct, indisputable. I wrote 3 tasks in my notebook: find their meeting records, retrieve his transaction history, get bed photos or recordings. This wasn't acting, it was survival. I understood clearly that once this marriage entered the divorce phase, with no children and no income, I would have to rely on evidence to fight for whatever dignity and leverage I could. I began to reorganize my daily routine, slicing the time I spent caring for the child into tiny increments, and reserving an hour each afternoon to take him for a walk, and during that hour I would detour past the office building where my husband worked to see if he was really working late. On the first day, he was indeed at the company. He didn't come out until 9 in the evening, his face drawn and tired, looking every bit like a husband who labored for his family. I started to waver. Was I overthinking it? The second day, he showed up beneath the office building but got into a stranger's car. The license plate wasn't his and it wasn't a company vehicle. I tailed them and saw the car park in the mall's underground garage. He got out and walked into a certain hotel. I stood behind the floor-to-ceiling window on the mall's 3rd floor, watching his silhouette step into the elevator, as if I were seeing myself locked inside that transparent box, unable to escape. He never came out. I waited for nearly 2 hours, my legs numb from standing, before I saw him walk out of the hotel shoulder to shoulder with a long-haired woman. She wore a mask, but I recognized that light gray trench coat. It was Sophia's. I took photos, I took videos, but my fingers kept mispressing because they were shaking. I didn't go home that night. I checked into a hotel with the child, staying in a room less than 2 kilometers from where he was meeting her. The child slept soundly while I lay awake all night. Photo after photo, video after video on my phone, I watched them over and over as if trying to confirm whether I was the one who had gone mad, or whether the world had. At 3 in the morning he texted me, "Working late today. It's too late to come back. Go to bed early." I replied, "Thank you for your hard work." The next morning when I returned home, my mother-in-law saw me and her face grew even darker. "How could you take the baby out and stay out all night again?" I smiled. "I saw a doctor last night. They said it's postpartum anxiety and I need to relax." She pressed her lips together and said nothing more, only that her looks grew more suspicious. I knew that if I didn't hurry, it would be too late. During the baby's nap, taking advantage of the quiet before they fell asleep, I contacted a friend at a law firm. She advised me to preserve all evidence, especially anything related to transfers of money. "If he's hiding assets or moving funds, this becomes more than just a marital issue," she said on the phone. "If you're going to sue, you have to do it with calmness, not with tears." I agreed, and I understood this would be a long tug-of-war. But as long as the child was by my side, I had a reason to keep going. That evening, my husband came home. Seeing my calm demeanor, he even bought me some fruit. He said, "I've been so busy lately, I haven't paid enough attention to you." I smiled and took the apple. "It's okay, I've been adjusting too." He breathed a sigh of relief, sat on the sofa, and started scrolling through his phone. I turned back to the bedroom, opened my laptop, backed up today's photos to a hidden drive, and began copying the backup file of his phone's call logs. The child murmured softly beside me. I turned to look at him and whispered, "Baby, give mommy a little more time." I was ready for this war. He would never have imagined that the obedient, quiet wife had, in the dark of night, drawn the first knife. That night he tossed and turned on the couch, unable to sleep. I lay in the bedroom pretending to be asleep, eyes closed, listening to him tiptoe to the fridge, drink water, light a cigarette. Wind blew in through the window, the door crack whispered. I did not move. After a dozen or so minutes he gently pushed the door open and looked at me. He said nothing and did not come in the end he closed the door and went out. I know where he went. The contact labeled dinner collaborator has been exchanging messages almost every day this week. I captured one of them and could clearly see the arranged time and place, and a blurry selfie, in a hotel room, he shirtless, and in the background that familiar gray-blue suitcase, Sophia's. This was no longer suspicion. It was naked evidence, the sound of the lie they had woven together for me coming apart. The next morning I went to the bank and pulled the statements for the accounts in my name. Our mortgage is under my name, and most household expenses go through my supplementary card. What I wanted to check was whether, in the past 2 months, he had used the joint account to spend money on her. Sure enough, on the statement I found multiple transfer successful entries, all to the same account ending digits. And that account was the ride-hailing payment account I had helped Sophia link years ago. I suddenly remembered that year when I helped her register for the teacher qualification exam using this very card. Later we laughed and said, "This card is like the witness to our friendship." Thinking about it now, it's ironically perfect. I held the bill and walked home very slowly. Movies played in my head, scene after scene of him washing my hair, her running errands to buy postpartum soup ingredients for me, the three of us taking a family portrait together. But now, in the photo they're still smiling, while I have become the biggest fool. I hadn't been home long when my phone rang. It was Sophia. "How have you been?" Her voice was as gentle as ever. "You didn't reply to my message yesterday, are you feeling okay?" I sat on the couch, my fingers trailing along the rim of a glass on the table, saying nothing. She seemed not to notice my silence and went on as if to herself, "By the way, our college crowd is getting together next week. Are you coming? Your other half should be there too, he said he wanted to bring you along." I murmured a soft "hmm." "You guys have become close lately?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, then her laughter. "Of course I'll get a bit closer to him when you two marry. I have to keep an eye on him for you, what if he gets out of line?" I laughed. "Thank you for always watching out for me." Her tone noticeably lightened. "Then you come over. When the time comes I'll do your hair and makeup, let him see how beautiful you are." "Okay." I agreed quickly, even with a hint of a smile. The moment I hung up, a strange sense of relief washed over me. I realized she didn't know, she thought everything was under control, while I had quietly reclaimed the initiative. I opened my laptop and packaged the transfer screenshots, photos, chat logs, and that hotel receipt into a single compressed file, naming it, Naivete. I knew this wasn't the evidence I would ultimately submit to the court, but it was a ritual for myself. I had to bury, with my own hands, the version of me that once trusted others unconditionally. In the days that followed, he seemed to sense my quietness and, paradoxically, became more attentive than before. He started coming home early, washing dishes and taking the kids without being asked, and at night he would gingerly ask, "Are you upset? I've been too busy lately and have been neglecting you." I looked at him, my eyes unmoved. "It's fine, I'm doing well. Don't bottle it up. Tell me if something's wrong." I gave a small smile. "I'll tell you when there is something." He nodded, leaned back on the sofa and started scrolling his phone, like an actor trying hard to play the role of a good husband, while I sat on the other side, silently keeping time in my head. This home had become a pantomime with a script, only the lead had long since exchanged souls. That night I had a dream. I dreamed the three of us went on a trip, the child was building sandcastles on the beach, and I and he stood under an umbrella chatting, sunlight warming our faces. In the dream I was laughing happily, but I woke up with my face wet with tears. I knew that dream wasn't about missing him, it was because I had once truly believed I was happy. The next afternoon I got a call from Sophia, her voice was urgent. "Lynn, I'm in trouble." I paused for a moment. "What's wrong?" I'm pregnant." She was crying on the phone. "I don't know what to do. He told me not to say anything yet, he said he'd handle it, but My fingers tightened slightly. "Are you sure it's his?" She was silent for 2 seconds, then said softly, "We never used a condom." I closed my eyes and felt myself sink into an indescribable void. "I didn't want you to know, I never intended to steal him, her voice grew fainter, "I just couldn't control myself." "I know," I said softly. She was stunned on the other end of the line. "You knew?" "For a long time," I said. "Did you think I was that stupid?" Her breathing quickened. "Then why didn't you expose me?" Because I was waiting for you to tell me yourself. I stood up, looking out at the gray, murky sky. You finally said it, that's good. She began to cry, Lynn. I didn't mean to, I really didn't. I hung up the phone and walked into the bedroom. The child had just woken, his eyes wet as he looked at me, a smear of milk at the corner of his mouth. I gently picked him up and said in his ear, Mom heard a very interesting sentence. He stared at me, half understanding. I bent down and kissed his forehead. I didn't mean to, what a convenient phrase. My phone buzzed, it was a message from my husband, I'll take you with me to the party. Let's show everyone how happy we are now. I stared at that line for several seconds, then slowly typed, sure, I was just about to see who could act it better. On the day of the party I put on makeup on purpose. Not heavy, just that kind of light makeup that makes you look especially well rested. Mascara lightly brushed, lips glossy, a faint smile on my face, like a wife who had just recovered splendidly from postpartum, a picture of happiness and gentleness. He froze for a moment when he saw me, then smiled and complimented, you look beautiful today. I handed my coat to the waiter and watched him in his newly bought shirt, his hair sprayed into place, like a groom just stepping over the threshold of marriage, still a little shy. His cautious attempts to please me struck me as ridiculous. The restaurant had been Sophia's choice, a private room, floor-to-ceiling windows, a decanter for the wine. Tonight's to welcome Lynn back and shake off the dust, she said. She wore a white dress, her belly was slightly rounded, cleverly concealed by a cardigan. She kept her head down as she ate, speaking little, lifting her eyes at me now and then with a look that seemed to be searching for forgiveness. I knew she was scared, she knew I was no longer that clueless housewife. At the table, someone asked about our child, and I naturally took up the thread, saying the baby sleeps through the night, smiles, and likes listening to me sing. She suddenly cut in, you two are so sweet, are you thinking of having another? I looked at her and smiled softly, I don't know, depends on whether my body can handle it. She lowered her eyes. Yeah, sometimes it's not just about wanting it. My husband cut me a piece of steak and whispered, eat slowly. I replied lightly and went on talking with the old classmate across from me about early childhood education. Sophia's hand clutched the napkin so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She knew I had already noticed her pregnancy, she just didn't know whether I would expose her in public. I didn't. I'm never the sort to rip the bandage off in front of everyone, I prefer to take my time, like crushing a glass cup, listening bit by bit to the sound of the cracks spreading. After dinner, the group suggested going to a KTV to keep the night going. She declined, saying she wasn't feeling well and left early. Before she went she casually said to me, drop by my place sometime, your red date and goji berry tea is the best. I nodded. Okay. If I suddenly show up at your door one day, don't be startled. She forced a smile. Come anytime. After she left, her husband sidled over quietly. Do you happen to know something? I looked at my wine glass. What do you think I should know? He hesitated and chuckled twice. I was just asking casually. I nodded gently. Then just listen casually. He didn't speak again, but that night he was unusually attentive. After we got home he poured me water, handed me towels, even voluntarily tidied up the baby's toys. I leaned against the window watching him hustle about, feeling so ironic. I had spent 3 years learning to depend on him, and now, in less than 3 months, I had learned how to make him invisible. Late at night I sent an email to the lawyer, forwarding the first draft of the compiled materials. Early the next morning the lawyer replied, the materials are preliminarily complete. I suggest you trace the flow of 3 transactions more precisely before filing. I began investigating those 3 most suspicious transfers. One was a small amount, but the payee was a gynecology clinic in the county town where Sophia grew up. My heart suddenly sank. She had mentioned that clinic to me before, run by her aunt, specializing in private consultations, cash payments, leaving no records. The only reasonable explanation I could think of was this: she had been pregnant before, more than once. I added that clue to the private medical expenses column in the evidence spreadsheet. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat at the computer sorting through the materials, and every time I typed a line my hand would uncontrollably tremble. Not from pain, but because I was unnaturally calm. So calm I felt like an avenger, not a mother who had given birth less than 2 months ago. At 3 a.m. he got up to use the bathroom and saw me still at the computer. He asked what I was doing. I smiled. The baby sleeps too much during the day, I'm resetting his biological clock. He leaned in to kiss me. I turned my face away and he kissed my temple instead. Go to bed earlier, he said. I hummed in response and stared at the transfer screenshot on the screen, calmly pressing save. On the third day I took the baby to get vaccinated. The doctor said the baby was healthy and developing well, but warned that the mother's mood swings needed attention because they can affect breastfeeding. I nodded. I've mostly adjusted. The doctor smiled. You're quite strong. I returned his smile. Yes, I was strong, because I had no other choice. Back home, I bathed the child and dressed him in the new little bear onesie. He giggled on the bed. I took a few photos and picked one to post. You grow up smiling, and that gives me a reason to keep living. My husband liked the post, no comment. A few minutes later, Sophia messaged me privately, you really look so good right now. I stared at her message and sent back a photo of the child, he is my life. She replied instantly, I understand. I looked at those 2 words and suddenly laughed out loud. How could she understand? She took my husband, tried to steal my family, and now even has her eyes on my child. What she understands is not my life, but how to drive a knife into the softest inch of it. I didn't reply. I dragged her from the top of my pinned list down to the very bottom. That afternoon I called to set a formal meeting with a lawyer. I'm going to fight this battle, I said, and I'm going to win. There was a few seconds of silence before the other party said, you must be prepared for the cost. I'm ready, I said. Tell me what to do next. The lawyer asked in a low voice, are you sure the child is the core of what you're fighting for? I didn't hesitate, yes. All right, she said, let's begin. I looked up at her and felt, for the first time, a kind of steadiness. It wasn't because of the case's chances of winning, but because I was no longer alone. I finally had the means to strike back, and a reason to do so. And they, a couple who fancied themselves clever and treated me like a mute fool, were still performing their little play in place. They didn't yet know that the stage had already collapsed. On the day we filed the case, it was very cold and drizzling. I left early with the child, and the lawyer was already waiting for me in the cafe opposite the Civil Affairs Hall. She saw me come in, stood up and took the file bag from my hands, then reached out to take and soothe my child as if it were second nature. She moved with the ease of someone with years of maternal and infant care experience, yet she was an unmarried lawyer in her early 30s, her features resolute. You've prepared this thoroughly. She flipped through the documents, her tone steady. With this set of materials filed, at least on the evidentiary chain, it's overwhelmingly in your favor. I nodded without saying much. I had indeed spent too much time and effort preparing these. I was waiting for a blade, but it had to be the kind that kills with a single strike. There is one thing you should know in advance. She paused. Your husband hasn't transferred large sums of assets, so there's no economic level illegality. As for your friend's pregnancy, unless she admits it or agrees to a DNA test, it will be hard to use that as key evidence to push a criminal complaint. I smiled lightly. She'll admit it. The lawyer looked at me and didn't ask anything more. By the time I carried the child home, the sky had cleared, the sunlight was thin as paper, but at least it wasn't cold. The house was as quiet as ever. My mother-in-law came over with a scowl. You went off running around with the child again? What do you think you are? I smiled. I think I'm a mother. What about you? She froze for a moment, not expecting me to talk back. What do you mean? You've always wanted to take the grandson, right? Wait until I get a divorce from him, then you can try applying for custody. Her expression changed instantly. What did you say? Are you crazy? I pulled the child closer, my smile gone. Say that again and see whether I'm crazy or not. She stepped back and finally fell silent. My husband came home in the evening, wearing the expression I always get when I'm in an especially good mood, and he even bought a bouquet from outside, holding it out to me, "For you." No special occasion, I just suddenly felt like giving it. I took the flowers and nodded. "What a coincidence, I prepared something to give you today too." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh? What is it?" I pulled him into the room, took the copy of the divorce papers from the drawer that I hadn't put in an envelope yet, and handed it to him. His smile froze in an instant. "What do you mean by this?" "Divorce," I said evenly. "The child stays with me. You can leave with nothing. The house is mine, the car is yours, and I will retain the right to pursue charges." He was stunned for a long moment, then as if suddenly coming to, snapped his head up. "You mean it?" I nodded. "Very much so." His expression shifted several times. "If you really insist on divorcing, I won't stop you, but you can't have the child." I laughed. "Do you have the means to provide? Do you have a regular work schedule? I printed out your records of nights you didn't come home, and I recorded the conversations between you and your friends about that friendship of yours." His voice shot up. "You secretly recorded me? When you were having an affair, why didn't you ask me first if it was okay?" I said coldly. He slammed the door in anger. "I won't sign." I watched the door and didn't follow. He wasn't afraid of losing me, he was unwilling to lose his control. He thought he could always wield over me the guise of doing it for your own good, but he forgot, even a hide like that will rot. The next day he indeed didn't come home. My mother-in-law didn't dare look me in the eye all day. At dinner she only said once, "Do you really want to destroy this family?" I put down my chopsticks. "I haven't had a home for a long time." She said nothing more. In the afternoon I got a call from the hospital. Sophia's name appeared on the emergency records. The doctor said she was bleeding heavily and needed urgent treatment, and the first thing she said upon being admitted was, "Please notify Lynn." When I arrived at the hospital, she was lying on the bed, her face pale, her lips bluish. When she saw me, tears poured from her eyes. "I'm sorry." I didn't go near her, I only stood at the bedside for 3 seconds. She said, "I saved the child." I looked at her, and for the first time I felt no anger, only a numbness. "You know, seeing you like this doesn't make me feel vindicated at all. Instead, it makes me a little sad." She sobbed harder. "I didn't mean to. I really. I." I looked down and cut her off. "You just want to snatch from me what you think you deserve. Too bad, you picked the wrong person." Her lips trembled as if trying to grab my hand. "I know I was wrong, please forgive me just this once." I took a step back, my tone as steady as if reciting a script. "I've forgiven you many times. From the first time you took him home drunk, to the first time you came to my house to cook confinement meals, every time you glanced at him, I kept telling myself she was just a friend." She cried without a sound, and suddenly the person standing before me felt utterly unfamiliar. "You didn't just steal a man," I said. "You took my whole world, you took away my most basic trust in people." I turned and walked away. She called my name from behind, but I didn't look back. Back home, my husband sat on the sofa and watched me come in, his gaze complicated. "Something happened to her, I know," he said. "The doctor called me." I took off my coat and put it in the closet. "She probably called a lot of people too." He said suddenly, "Aren't you even a little sad?" I stood still and looked at him. "You're upset, does that mean I can't be clear-headed?" He shut his mouth. I didn't cook dinner, he didn't say a word. I knew he was starting to be afraid. He saw that I wasn't throwing a tantrum, I was truly preparing to end it. The next day I received a text from the court. The lawsuit had entered the trial stage. I held the child on the balcony, watching the road below glinting after being washed by the rain. The child cooed and smiled at me, sunlight fell on his face like a tiny glittering universe. I ran my fingers through his soft hair and said quietly, "Mom won't let you see dirty things anymore." He kept giggling, milk still at the corner of his mouth. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. In that moment, I felt like I had really won. Not that I had beaten the two people who had deceived me, but that I had beaten the version of myself who used to fall apart at the drop of a hat and cry through an entire pillow. He was still sitting on the sofa, his phone screen lit and went dark, no more messages, no more goodnights. At last, it was his turn to stay up alone. On the day of the court hearing it rained, the sky as gray as the veil they had draped over my wedding 3 years ago, dull, yet oppressively close, making it hard to breathe. I wore a minimalist cut black long coat, my hair tied back, light makeup, no jewelry. Holding the child at the courthouse steps, a few strangers couldn't help but look over. They were probably wondering how a woman who had given birth less than 3 months ago could dare to come alone to argue a divorce. The child was very quiet. Lulled by the sound of rain, he fell asleep, his small hand resting on the edge of the swaddling, pink and soft, as if he understood nothing. But he did understand. He felt the subtle shifts in my mood and knew that the world was, little by little, overturning the definition of home as it had been at the moment of his birth. My husband had come accompanied by his mother, his face pale and his eyes restless. Seeing me and the child, he wanted to say something, but swallowed the words. My mother-in-law, however, was less restrained. She sneered as soon as she came up. "So you really plan to play the act to the end?" I looked at her calmly. "I'm not acting, this is my life." She rolled her eyes. "Fine, fine, fine. You act, we won't." Once we got to the courtroom, he finally couldn't sit still. He deliberately caught my eye, trying to detect the slightest trace of hesitation, compromise, or even a flicker of hope on my face. But I had been reading the documents the whole time. It wasn't that I was deliberately ignoring him, it's just that he no longer deserved even a single glance from me. The judge announced the court was in session and the proceedings formally began. The two of us shifted from being husband and wife to opposing parties. The lawyer he hired began to present his spiel about his stable financial capability, sincere willingness to parent, and plans for the child's future education. I listened to those hollow words and felt like laughing. He worked so hard to craft the image of a good dad, but he forgot that he couldn't even get up at night to make a bottle, and he had never once noticed the baby wore a wet diaper for 3 days. When it was my turn to speak, my lawyer calmly laid out my actual ability to perform as the primary caregiver, and submitted dozens of pieces of evidence, records of nights he didn't come home, transfer histories, proof of his affair, and so on. When those recordings were played, he kept his head down and the skin behind his ears flushed little by little. And when Sophia's pregnancy record was formally submitted to the court as supplemental material, his mother in the audience suddenly stood up and shouted, "She's lying. Nothing like that ever happened in our family." The judge struck the gavel. "Please remain silent." I didn't even turn my head, I merely nodded to my lawyer. We handed over a photocopy of Sophia's hospital signature sheet. The handwriting on the signature line, no matter how familiar she was with it, she couldn't fail to recognize it. It was her son's. At that moment, my mother-in-law seemed to be shoved by an invisible hand. She collapsed back into her seat, her lips pale. He finally looked up and stared at me. The look was no longer anger but terror. He probably truly never imagined that one day I would lay out all his filthy deeds, page by page, before everyone. The judge announced a recess. The next hearing would address custody and the division of assets. I walked out of the courtroom to find reporters already blocking the door. Someone must have leaked the news early, some snapping photos, others shouting questions. "Can you respond to whether the third party's pregnancy in this case is true?" I didn't stop. I only bowed my head and tightened the swaddling cloth. But the moment I stepped out of the courthouse, I suddenly remembered 3 years ago this man kneeling before my parents and saying, "Don't worry, I'll treat her well for the rest of my life." Now, that vow was nothing more than a puff of breath from his mouth, blown and scattered. That night I packed some of our things and moved with the child into a temporary apartment my friend had found. It wasn't big, but it was clean, sunny, with water and electricity in order. I stood on the balcony and for the first time truly felt the air of freedom. No mother-in-law's disdainful glances, no husband's perfunctory responses, and no Sophia's attentions. My phone lit up, a message from Sophia, "We've already lost enough." Please stop, okay? I deleted her. Another message came in, this time from him. My mom's been unwell these past few days. Could you think about the child's custody? It's not that I'm not willing. I just want him to have more contact with us in the future. I replied, you're overthinking it. He was silent for 2 days after that. On the third day, he sent a photo of a court document, his signature on a consent form. The child is mine, the house is mine, he keeps the right to visit once a month. I stared for a long moment, then gently laid my hand on the child's back. He finally understood that I was no longer the woman he could control. That night I bathed the child, steam swirled around us, and he giggled as he grabbed my fingers. I held him against the headboard and, for the first time, closed my eyes without being on guard. In my dream I stood on the courthouse steps, the sunlight was blinding and the wind lifted my hair. Someone asked me, have you ever regretted it? I said, I don't regret the divorce, I only regret every moment I once defended him. When I woke, the child was tugging at my clothes, his face pressed against my chest. I looked at him and suddenly felt a measure of relief. I knew that for this story to come to this point was, in a way, the end of a chapter. But I had no intention of stopping there. A woman like me, who has been hurt and crushed, can't truly turn her life around by merely walking away. I will rise higher, force him to look up at me, make her regret her choices, and make everyone who underestimated me understand one thing. The kind of woman who can crawl back up from the ruins is the one you least want to mess with.